An author's perspective is his or her thoughts or feelings about a topic. It's important to know an author's perspective because we know all text is written by a human being, and human beings naturally have opinions and thoughts about the topics that they're writing about. So if you know the author's perspective, you can analyze the information they present more analytically to make sure that they're presenting a balanced case rather than perhaps letting some bias sneak in based on his or her own opinion. To help you define the author's perspective, there's several different things you can look at within the text. The first is to look at the title or the introductory paragraph. Often the title will let you know what the author feels about a topic, and that introductory paragraph might even present his or her thesis or perspective. From there, you can also look at the text headings. These are almost like little mini titles, and they can provide further information about how the author is going to develop his central idea and what he or she thinks about that idea. Next, you can dig deeper into the facts and evidence that the author is choosing to include. Based on that author's perspective, he or she might include specific facts and leave out other facts. This can help you to know what the author's opinion is on the topic and therefore the author's perspective. Going even deeper, you can look at the author's specific word choice. You have to be careful as you do this, though, to make sure that you're thinking about what is the author saying or is the author quoting someone else, to really distinguish what is the mood or the tone that the author is creating based on the choice of words that are included in the text. And finally, if it's provided, you can look at the author's credentials or where the source came from. Sometimes it'll give you an idea about the background of that author and may provide some insight into author's perspective or any bias the author might have. So for our story, we have the Super Bowl's evolution from game to entertainment extravaganza. So the first thing I want to do is look at that title because that title can give me a clue about what the author thinks. I also can look at this set of paragraphs here as the introduction to have an opinion about what the author thinks. So in this case, it seems the author is talking about a sequential change from just a game to a bigger entertainment event. And as I skim and scan through here, it's kind of confirmed that it's talking about how the game itself perhaps hasn't always been the most exciting thing, but people are still tuning in. And so they had to figure out a way to make it more of an event for people who are viewing. And so right here, it talks about to make up for this, the National Football League adds all kinds of entertainment, and the game itself often attracts less information than the fireworks and the pop stars and the shows and all those types of things. So for me, I feel like this is kind of that central idea, that the Super Bowl has transitioned from just a simple football game to a full entertainment event. Now, the author's perspective is closely related to the central idea, but it's not exactly the same. This is the thesis that the author is developing. It's the big idea that the author is going to talk about and provide numerous details about. The perspective, then, is what the author feels about this central idea. So as we're reading, we want to think about what does the author feel about this fact that it's gone from just a game to now this big extravaganza. The next thing I can do is I can look at the text headings for additional information. So I can see we're going to talk about the super boring bowl and how even though it's a super boring bowl, the show must go on. People are still tuning in. One way that perhaps they've done that is by adding advertisements. But I find this one kind of interesting. Will things ever change? That kind of gives me a hint that perhaps this author is feeling like the transition maybe has not been the best transition, and they're looking to see if maybe we can revert back or change to a different path. So, I've looked at the title, I have an idea of that central idea, I've read through my kind of introduction, and I've looked at each of these text headings to kind of get a feel for what the author might be saying about this topic. From there, I want to go even deeper and look at the specific details that the author provides. So I can see within the super boring bowl, the author talks about how generally the Super Bowl has been fairly boring because the games aren't close. We talk about the sports writers have called it unbearably dull, and that many Americans aren't interested in the game because it's not a very close game. But the show must go on. We realized that the NFL was still going to have people who are tuning into the show, and so they decided to focus on producing bigger and more exciting games. And while the games started off as being fairly simple, since then we've added in more superstars, and that this has actually started to shift some of that focus away from the game and more onto those superstars. Another way that people have kind of drawn their attention away from the game itself is through the ad bowl. So we can see that television advertising has also shifted some of that attention away from the game. And while advertising didn't used to be a big part of the game, people realized that there's such a big audience at the Super Bowl that it was just too big of an opportunity to miss, that they wanted to put their commercials there. And so therefore, these ads have started to get bigger and better, and that has continued to pull information or attention away from the football game. In our last section, we thought perhaps this would show a little bit more about the author's perspective about this transition of events. Notice all of this has really been fairly sequential, kind of describing how we've evolved from a simple game to this big entertainment extravaganza. In this last section, though, the author talks about how the Super Bowl has actually become a little bit more exciting. But even though it's become more exciting, people still are interested more in the commercials or the halftime show itself, not in the game. And this statement talks about some of us hunger for the good old days when the Super Bowl was about the game itself. So this is kind of talking about, even though things have changed to correct some of the problems of the Super Bowl not being as exciting, the game itself, people still are focusing on the non-football aspects of the game, even though there's a small group of people who are thinking, well, let's go back to the good old days when football games were really about football. So I've got an idea of the central idea. I've looked at the text headings to kind of think about how that central idea is developed across the story, and I've looked at specific evidence. A lot of that evidence was just a sequential retelling of history, kind of how we've gone from the simple game to a bigger extravaganza. Now I really want to get down to the author's word choice and think about what is his or her opinion about this transition. As I was going through, there were several things that stood out to me. Within this one, the idea that the author is calling the Super Bowl super boring, that starts me thinking, well, maybe the author does like this transition. If the Super Bowl is super boring, then we need to do something to spice it up. This is confirmed when we talk about the sports writers call it unbelievable dull. Now, you have to be careful here. This is the sports writer's opinion, not necessarily the author's opinion. So at this point, I might even choose to not focus on this as word choice because I'm attributing it to the sports writers, not to the author itself. And author's perspective is all about what the author thinks. Then later, when he uses that idea of it being bigger and more exciting, that could be positive, but he also calls it expensive and distracting. That seems more negative. And then he even goes on to talk about how it becomes fancier. Now, my idea of that connotation behind that word fancier is that you're almost kind of mocking it. You're putting it up on a pedestal and saying, you know, that's elevated, it's beyond me. So I'm starting to get this feeling that he acknowledged that maybe in general it was kind of boring, but that these changes have become expensive, distracting, fancier. And he goes on to talk about how it's pulling the focus away from football. All of this is kind of communicating that idea that maybe this author really enjoys the football aspect of it, and that he feels like these add-ons that other people find entertaining are more of a distraction. Then he goes on to talk about how those commercials are attention-grabbing. And that makes me think of when people are described as attention-seeking, and that's certainly not a good thing. And finally, this last paragraph really cements it home for me. He talks about how the games have actually become more exciting. That kind of negates what he talked about in the beginning, how they used to be or generally were super boring. And when he talks about how he is hungering for the good old days, that really lets you know that he is craving us to go back in time. And that back in time was when it was about the game and not about all of this extra entertainment. And he kind of then laments that, well, maybe those days will never come again. So I started by thinking about the title and the text headings that helped me to get an idea for the central idea. Then I looked at what evidence the author was choosing to portray, and all of his facts were really just kind of supporting that development of the history of how this transition came to be. As far as facts or opinions that were missing, he really didn't include a lot of facts or opinions about the people who still do really like the game until he got here to his conclusion. And in a way that almost strengthened that part, because that's the last thing we read and the last thing we remember is about how maybe there are people who want to go back to the good old days of just having straight football. When we got to the word choice, now that really cemented it for us. We started to look at how the author is talking about these changes as being attention-grabbing or fancier or expensive and distracting, and how he hungers for the good old days, and maybe those days will not actually come. The final thing to prove or disprove would be to think about the author's credentials. In this case, we don't know much about these authors, so there's not a lot I can do. It came from Newsela, who typically tries to present things on a fairly unbiased manner, unless it's doing a pro-con article, in which case, again, it's showing both sides. So there wasn't much I could get from the credentials in this place. If I look at steps 1 through 4, however, my big idea here is that it appears that the football game, or the Super Bowl, has transitioned from being a simple game to this big, extravagant event. And while many people seem to appreciate that change, this particular author's perspective is that I think he would rather have it go back to the way things were. That perhaps since the game itself is becoming more interesting, that all of these other things like the advertisements and the pregame show and the halftime show, those are just fluff that's taking attention away from the true purpose, which is the game. So my opinion of the author's perspective is that since the game has started to improve and become more exciting, that, I believe it's a he, let's double check, Peter, that Peter and Mark feel as though we really maybe should go back to the way it used to be, where the focus was on the good old football game, and less attention was paid to expensive shows and artists and those types of things. Go ahead and think about this, and if you have any questions, you can ask your teacher.